I'm going to save time for questions at the end, so please save those. Unless something is like abundantly unclear, you have to know immediately, then you can raise your hand. All right, so I'm going to be talking about a study that I did last year called the Athlete Peace Survey, and peace stands for pain, exercise, and cannabis experience. But before I start with that, I just want to give a little bit of background on how I got into doing cannabis research. And I'm going to start off by saying right off the bat that I use cannabis. I use it every day. I use THC and I use CBD. I have severe chronic pain, and I microdose, so I take small doses throughout the day to help with the symptoms of my condition, and I use THC for sleep. So in 2008, I won the Ironman 70.3 World Championships in what was then a world record time. When I went back in 2009 to defend my title, I had a terrible bike accident at one of the aid stations. The person who was handing me the water bottle did not let go of the water bottle and essentially pulled me off my bike. And I flipped over my handlebars and I broke my collarbone. I've got this lovely plate right here. And I did permanent damage to my rib cage, both structurally and neuropathically. And due to that, and that was 10 years ago, and to this day I still suffer from the repercussions of that accident. And I have nerve damage to my intercostal nerves, which are the nerves that run between your ribs. And they do a lot of things, and so when they don't function well, you end up with a lot of problems. One of them being difficulty breathing. My diaphragm is always in spasm. I get this kind of pain, like I'm being squeezed between my ribs. I get just these like shudders that rock my whole body and wake me up at night. So it's pretty profound. And traditional pharmaceuticals really weren't working for me in terms of helping with sleep and the spasms and the pain. And my husband, who's sitting back there, Mark, had recommended to me that I should try cannabis. I had a qualifying medical condition with the nerve pain, but as a former professional athlete, it really just didn't seem like something that I could wrap my head around, because during the time I was racing, cannabis was illegal in all forms. And so the rules have changed since then, but at that time, you couldn't have any of it in your system. Now it's different. CBD is legal, and THC is a threshold drug. So it's legal out of competition. And if you get tested in competition, you can have it in your system up to a certain level. But that was not the case when I was racing. And compounded with that, this sort of stigma of being a professional athlete, I also was doing research just down the street at the Institute for Behavioral Genetics, which is part of CU. And I was doing drug use and abuse research in adolescents and young adults. And we saw some profoundly disturbed kids with conduct disorder and multiple drug problems. And so this was another stigma for me, was that I was, really seeing sort of the very bad side. It just didn't occur to me that there could be a medical benefit to cannabis. But eventually you get desperate, and I was very desperate. And when it became legal recreationally here, it at least lifted a barrier of trying to find a doctor to give me a prescription. And so I marched into a dispensary onto the farm, and I said, well, can you give me something for sleep? And I've got some pain. And they said, well, here's some gummies, and here's a patch, and slapped the patch on my ankle, and I was so high I couldn't even stand up. But guess what? I slept. So I knew that there was going to be some benefit there. It was just going to take some work to figure out what the best ratios and dosing was going to be. And that was more than 5 years ago. And I'm still determining dosing and ratio, because products change and your body changes. But I can say for myself personally that it's been incredibly helpful for a lot of the problems that I have. And so as a researcher, I was sort of like, well, what are other people's experiences? And I started hearing a lot of stories about how cannabis was helping people with a multitude of health issues. But when I went to the literature, there really wasn't a lot on the research side. And I kept hearing from people, well, there's no research, and it's all anecdotal, and it's not legitimate, it's not true. And the fact that people say there's no research, well, there is research. There's just not sort of the gold standard clinical trials because of the legal status. They can't be done. But cannabis research has been going on for decades, and it proves to be medically beneficial for a lot of different things. And so I decided, well, I'm an epidemiologist. I have studied this before. I'm going to study it now in a different way. In the past, most people have studied sort of the adverse effects, and I wanted to take a more balanced look. How can we get patients using cannabis most effectively and safely so that they can mitigate the symptoms of whatever they're trying to use it for? And so that was how I got started doing this athlete study, and formed Canna Research Group, a group of people who are interested in looking at cannabis in an epidemiological way. So before I start with my study, I want to just give some background. about cannabis and why it could potentially work for medical conditions. And so there's something called the endocannabinoid system, and that's in all of our bodies. We all have an endocannabinoid system, and there are 3 parts to it. We have the cannabinoid receptors, we have CB1 and CB2, and I'm gonna have another slide that shows you where it's expressed in your body. And then we make things called endocannabinoids that our body produces that actually binds to those receptors. And then we have metabolic enzymes that break down the cannabinoids after they've been used. So we have this in our body, and it creates homeostasis. And when there's something off with this dysregulation, you can end up with a disease state. So this just shows you where these receptors are expressed in the body. And so there's some overlap between CB1 and CB2, and some of them are just expressed in certain places and others not. So you can see that if you activate CB1, then it might be beneficial for some things, and if you activate CB2, it might be beneficial for other things. So pretty much, not entirely, but pretty much, THC binds to CB1 and CBD binds to CB2, but there's also loose binding of CBD to CB1, which sort of takes away some of the effects of THC. So if you take THC by itself, you'll often get the psychoactive effects of it, but if you add a little CBD to it, or a lot for some people, it actually takes those psychoactive effects down because it sort of takes away that high. So there's a lot of confusion about what is cannabis anyway. And so cannabis is sort of the broad plant. And then underneath that, we've got hemp. And hemp, by definition, means it has less than 0.03% of THC. And then we have what we call marijuana, which is sort of the traditional plant that we think about. Maybe when we were younger, we'd smoke and get high, and that's going to have a lot higher level of THC. And hemp became federally legal at the end of last year when the Farm Bill got passed. Marijuana is still federally illegal, but states have now been legalizing it state by state. I think 33 states now have medical marijuana legal, and I'm not exactly sure how many have recreational. And so CBD can come from either hemp, or it can be extracted from marijuana. So when people talk about hemp-derived CBD, that means it's coming from the hemp plant, not coming from the marijuana plant. So I talked about endocannabinoids. Those are the ones that we make in our body. The cannabinoids that come from the plant are called phytocannabinoids. And so you're taking it in from elsewhere. And they bind to these endocannabinoids. And so the cannabis plant has hundreds of cannabinoids. The ones that we're most familiar with, THC, the most famous one, and CBD, which is now all the rage. And then we have all these other different cannabinoids, and there are also terpenes and other flavonoids and other parts of the plant. And when you take the plant as a whole, it's said that you get your best effect because it's called the entourage effect, that when all of them are working together synergistically, that's when you're going to have the most benefit from the plant. And then finally, I just want to talk about sort of, how do we legitimize cannabis? And I just don't like calling it weed. I don't like calling it pot. I actually did an interview for a news outlet recently about my study, and I'm very careful to call it cannabis because it is cannabis, especially if you're using it medically, you want to have a medical term for it. And sure enough, when the story came out, they had me quoting, "Yes, I use weed," or "weed is good for athletes," or "weed does this for athletes." And I was just so angry. I emailed her and I said, I didn't call it weed, I call it cannabis. And so I think that calling it the right thing helps legitimize it. And so if you know somebody that's using it medically, calling them a stoner or a pothead, doesn't make you feel very good. And so, I don't like it when people call me a pothead. This is my medicine, and I'm using it responsibly, and even if I was using it to get high, that doesn't matter. So I think that it matters the terminology that we use for this. So that brings me to the study that we did last year, the Athlete Peace Survey. And so the reason why I decided to start with athletes, aside from the fact that I'm an athlete and athletes are my people, I've been hearing a lot of stories about athletes using cannabis, particularly in the ultra world, and a lot of products are being formulated for athletes. It's all the rage now. We've got CBD for athletes. It's going to change your life, and you're going to be a superstar. But one of the things that I understood was that there were no studies in adult athletes looking at cannabis. We don't know what percentage of athletes were using. We don't know why they used it. We don't know what the effects were. We don't know how they use it. Now, there are a lot of studies in adolescent athletes. They've looked at it in university athletes. They've looked at it in professional athletes, but they haven't looked at it in athletes, us sitting here. You know, the people who are really making up the bulk of athletes, those of us who are just going out and, you know, doing Ironmans or 5Ks, but aren't professionals and just are doing it for the love of the sport. And so I decided, well, this would be a great place to start. So the aims for the study were to characterize cannabis use in what we call self-defined, community-based athletes. So there were no restrictions on what sport people played. I didn't care what level they were, so we did actually have some professionals in our sample. It didn't matter how many hours per week, it didn't matter how long. I didn't care, because I measured all of that. And so we were able to look at that in the analysis part. And then I also wanted to look and see, you know, for the athletes who said that they were using cannabis, what were the positive and adverse effects? Because we just don't know. So before you do any study of this kind, if you want it to be legitimate and you want to be able to publish it, you've got to go through an institutional review board. So I put my protocol through a community IRB, it's called, and they approved my protocol. Everything was anonymous. We did this on Survey Gizmo, and I did the bulk of my recruitment through social media, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn. I went on different online forums. I did drop off some things at some running stores and hand them out, but mostly this was done predominantly online. Oops. So, like I mentioned, because I didn't really care what sport people were playing, I collected that information. And I also looked at, you know, age and gender and ethnicity. And then I also wanted to find out, out of curiosity as a chronic pain patient, I wanted to find out what are people's pain status and how does that affect their cannabis use. So we asked about whether people had current pain, meaning pain lasting less than 3 months, greater than 3 months, or no pain whatsoever. So the way I measured current cannabis use was, in the past 2 weeks, have you used marijuana? And I use the word marijuana here, even though I like the word cannabis better, because marijuana is more understood. And look, things change so much that if I was to do this study again today, I would use the word cannabis, because in the 6 months since I've done this, words have changed and people's knowledge have changed. But at the time, marijuana seemed to be the best word to use, but I did differentiate whether people were using THC, CBD, or both. So that's what I asked them. If they said yes to using it, I wanted to find out. Now, I did not ask about dosing, because it's very hard to know. There's no standard of labeling. So it's not like you go to CVS and you buy your ibuprofen and you know that 200 milligrams is a dose. You take a pill, it's 200 milligrams. When you look at the labeling on a lot of the CBD products, it's not clear what it is. If you're using tinctures and I say to people how much you're using, 3 drops. Well, what does that mean? They have no idea. So I felt rather than confuse the matter, I just would leave that out entirely. And then I asked whether people were using it recreationally, medically, or both. And so then I wanted to find out people's responses, subjective effects. How did it make you feel? So I had 9 items that were positive. I had 8 items that were adverse. And then I wanted to find out what are the effects on specific pain, muscle, joint, nerve, and migraine. So these are the positive and adverse effects that I measured. I'm sure there are other things I could have put on here, but these seem to be the ones that would be most highly endorsed based on other studies that I looked at. Plus, when I was at CU doing my research there on marijuana, subjective effects is my specialty. So I kind of looked at the items that we had studied during that time and put together this list. So this is sort of how it all worked out. Participants had to be greater than or equal to 21 years of age, because that's the legal age for if you live in a legal state to purchase it. We had enrollment from, so exactly a year ago this started. So from September 6th until December 7th of last year, 1,274 people initiated the survey, 1,161 completed the survey, and 301 said that they had used cannabis in the last 2 weeks. So for our entire 1,161 people, it was 62% male. I tried very hard to try and get a more equitable split, but as it turns out, our primary sports were triathlon and cycling, and those have a male bias. So I just really couldn't close that gap, but it does sort of reflect the greater statistics of those sports in general. And then the age split was just under 68% were 40 and over. So our sample is predominantly Caucasian. Most people are employed full-time, and this was a highly educated group. Most people had a bachelor's or an advanced degree. So you can see here by the sport, so running, cycling, and triathlon are our three primary sports. The other group was comprised of swimming, winter sports, hiking, yoga. It was just a smattering of everything. And so I asked about people's athlete status. So most people said that they were competitive. We had some fitness athletes, and then the recreation, the other group were a very small percentage of professionals. I think maybe 2% of our sample were professional athletes. And then when I asked about hours per week of exercise, you can see the breakdown here. This is a very active group. I mean, 46%, 11 plus hours per week of exercise. So, you know, what I find interesting about this is when people talk about stoners and being lazy and all of this, and we've got this group of people who are exercising so much, it really kind of dispels that myth. So in terms of pain, this group has a lot of pain. 49% indicated they had pain. 40% of those have chronic pain, which is a little bit more than double what the general population average of chronic pain is, which is really interesting to me because, you know, most chronic pain patients don't do very much, yet here we have this chronic pain population that's exercising 11 plus hours per week. So it tells you a lot. Very motivated group. And then I asked about whether people were living in a state that cannabis was legal, and it was about 50-50. Some people didn't know. And then, so like I mentioned, 301 said that they used cannabis in the last 2 weeks. That's 26% of our sample. Oh, I should have asked you what you thought. I should have made you guess. Actually, it's really funny. I gave a talk a couple months ago, and I was on a panel with some former professional NBA players, and there were a lot of former sports players from the big leagues. And when I asked them what percent do you think use cannabis, they're like 90%. Because in the leagues, even though it's not legal there, a lot of them are using cannabis because they have severe pain, and so it seems to help a lot of the symptoms that they have. Pain and anxiety, a lot of them are addicted to opioids, and so cannabis has been very beneficial, and there's a lot of talk now in the leagues of trying to get this legalized for them. So now we're going to switch to just our cannabis users, those 301 people that said that they used it in the last 2 weeks. And so I wanted to know, well, how are you using it? And so 33% said that they use it medically, and most of those 33% were the people who were 40 and older. So the older adults in our sample tended to use it medically. And then we had recreational. A lot of people are using it both, which is interesting that people make that distinction of, okay, I'm going to use this for a medical reason, maybe they use it topical, and then they think, okay, and then I'm going to use it recreationally. So it's very interesting to make that distinction. And then in terms of what people are using, almost 50% are co-using THC and CBD. And I call it co-using because I don't know if they're using it simultaneously, if they use CBD in the morning and THC at night, but at some point they're using both. And then 20% are using THC, and almost 34% are using CBD only. And that group that's using it medically, who are over 40, they are predominantly using CBD only. When I asked how long, 51% were using it less than 3 years, and 49% are using it 4 times a week or more. So a lot of people here are using it very regularly for whatever reasons they're using it, medical, recreational, or both. So here's the big thing you want to know. Well, what's it doing? So 71% said that they had improved sleep. 69% said that they had less pain. 58% said it calmed them down. And 54% said they had decreased anxiety, and only 2.3% said they had no benefit whatsoever. So what's the flip side? Adverse effects. Oh, sorry, that's next. So like I said, I wanted to ask about specific pain. So 61% of the current cannabis users said that they're using it for pain. So that's pretty interesting. And so when you ask about specific pain, 85% said that it was very much or moderately effective for muscle pain, 82% for joint pain, 79% for migraine, and 76% for nerve pain. So it's interesting that there are differences in how it's working for various types of pain. So when we look at the adverse events, the majority of people said that they did not have any adverse events. 24% had an increased appetite, 21% had anxiety. So it's kind of interesting that there was a large proportion of people that said they had decreased anxiety. We also had some people said that they had anxiety. And it's not uncommon for one drug to have opposite effects. And it could be dosing, so at a smaller dose, it decreases your anxiety, but a higher dose, it increases it, or it just could be differential between people. And then finally, just under 17% said that they had difficulty concentrating. So what everyone wants to know, well, should I use CBD, should I use THC, or should I use both? And so I pulled out those 4 most frequently endorsed benefits, and I looked at how people were using their cannabis. And when you look at all of these things, people who were co-using CBD and THC had the most benefit. And, except for anxiety, people who were using CBD, not even for CBD, CBD alone was having less of an effect, particularly for the anxiety and for the pain. And this has been shown in a lot of studies, by the way, that using CBD and THC is going to give you the best effect, because we talked about this entourage effect. And there actually have been some clinical trials done in other countries with a drug called Sativex. It's a sublingual spray, and that's a 1-to-1 formulation of CBD and THC, and it's been shown to help with spasticity and some other conditions, and it's approved in Europe, and people are using it. So it's not unusual that we found that people co-using THC and CBD had the most benefit. And then in terms of the adverse effects, well, again, if you co-use THC and CBD, you're going to have your most adverse effects, because it is a THC that sort of increases appetite and causes some of these unwanted effects. And so the goal always is to find that perfect dosing where you maximize your benefit and you minimize your adverse effects. And I would say, I did put increased appetite in sort of the adverse effects, but for some people, like myself, increased appetite is one of the very important things that I get from THC. I have severe nausea from my condition, and my appetite often is just not there, and THC, boy, does it do a good job, and I know that for cancer patients, it's instrumental in helping them keep an appetite, so it really is very helpful for that. So, conclusions. Well, 26% of community-based athletes are using cannabis. They use it for pain relief, and it's pretty effective for that. Cannabis improves sleep. A lot of endurance athletes have insomnia. Hard workouts might make your muscles twitch a little bit, or maybe you're amped up, and cannabis kind of helps calm that down. And we found a combination of THC and CBD offer the most benefit, but it also offers the most adverse effects. But if you looked at the percentages of the benefits far outweighed the adverse effects. So what does this mean? Well, it could be beneficial for a variety of ailments. But when people start to use cannabis, I say to them, define the reason for your use. Just like you make goals for your training, you need to make goals for cannabis. So if you just say, I want to feel better, that's too nebulous. It's not really defined. But if you say, I want to sleep better, or I have anxiety most of the time and I want to decrease that, or gee, my knee hurts, now you've defined a goal, and it's very tangible. Because depending upon what you're using it for is going to really probably change whether you use a topical, or if you use an edible, or if you use a tincture, if you need a high CBD product, or if you need a high THC product. So really think about why you want to use cannabis. I always recommend that people talk to a cannabis doctor before they start using it, because there could be interactions with other medications you're taking, and it is a drug, and it can have harmful effects. You want to use it responsibly, and get educated before you start. Don't just say, well, my friend is using this, I'm going to use it too. Your friend might have differential effects than you might have. Everybody is very different in how they respond to it. One person's 1 milligram of THC could be another person's 50 milligrams. So everybody really just get educated. And the big thing that we talk about in the world of cannabis is start low, go slow. You want to start with a very small dose. You can always add more later, but if you take too much and you get too high, or something bad happens, it's very hard to undo it. So really start at a small dose. You can always titrate up as needed. And track your use and your symptoms. There are apps that you can use for your phone that you can download so that if you're initiating a session, you can say, I'm using it because I have pain, my pain level is this, and this is what I took, this is how many milligrams, and then 20 minutes later, they'll ping you and say, how are you feeling? And you put that in, and it'll track it over time. So then you can figure out, well, is this dosing working for me? Is this product the right one for me? Because it's very hard to remember. I mean, I'm in this field I have a lot of knowledge about it. I've been using cannabis for 5 years, and sometimes I have no idea what I'm doing. So it's really important to track it. And I have tried tracking it just by keeping notes on my phone. Impossible. So, really try to be systematic about it. And if something doesn't work, it doesn't mean that cannabis doesn't work. Now, if you have a severe adverse reaction, and you have some respiratory or you're vomiting, well, cannabis isn't for you. But if you just try it and it just doesn't give you the relief that you had wanted, it might mean that you're not using the right dose, the right ratio of CBD and THC. You might not be going with the right route of administration. So don't be afraid to experiment, because at this point, there really aren't a lot of guidelines. Really, that's what we're trying to do here with the research we're doing, is to help create those guidelines. But because there aren't any right now, some of it's going to be self-exploration. Now, let's talk about CBD. CBD is all of the rage. I mean, there were CBD hamburgers, you can get CBD coffee, you can get CBD in anything. And the question is, well, does CBD even work? And CBD is not regulated in the same way that THC is regulated. So if you are in Colorado and you want to buy a THC product, you have to go to a dispensary to purchase your THC. And if you go to the dispensary to purchase your THC, it has been tested by a state-regulated lab. And so it gets a little sticker and you know what's in it. CBD, on the other hand, you can go to Lucky Market and buy it. You can buy it on the internet. You can get it anywhere. And there isn't always transparent testing. Maybe there isn't any at all. Some companies do put their certificate of analysis on their website so that you know that they have done some testing and you can look at it and see. Consumer Labs is a great resource. They test products all the time, and they will tell you what products they believe in, because their testing has shown that what is on the product is what they tested. But the really unfortunate thing is that a lot of the products that they're purchasing, as you see here, that they're not accurately labeled. A lot of products will tell you it's CBD only, but when they test it, it actually has THC in it. So buyer beware, okay? All CBD is not the same. So a final word, cannabis doesn't work for everyone. It doesn't work for everything. It is not a cure-all. I sort of fell into the trap of thinking that cannabis was going to be a cure-all for my condition. And I was very frustrated that I was still having pain and still having symptoms and still needed to have other treatments. Last year, I went to a conference and I listened to a medical cannabis doctor speak, and he said, just because you still have to take other products, you're on other medications, it doesn't mean that cannabis failed. It just means that it's just one tool in your tool chest. And it really changed my perspective, because I realized, I'm in a lot of pain right now, this moment. I had a horrible day. I've been very sick, yet I'm here. And why is that? It's because cannabis alleviates it enough that it gets me out the door. It gives me a sense of calm and well-being that I don't get from any other medication that I take. And so it's not a be-all, end-all. It isn't going to, may cure some people, but it's not going to cure everybody. And it may just be part of a multimodal approach where you still have to eat well, you still need to have good nutrition. You can't overtrain just because you think I'm going to take cannabis later. So you still have to be smart about what you do. And so that's it, if anybody has any questions.
Questions for Joanna?
Yes.
Seems like maybe it's a little outside of the scope of what you're talking about, and I don't really understand this so really, because it sounds like inflammation is an important part of the healing, sort of muscle building process. And my understanding is that the CBD can actually counteract some of that inflammation. There's a potential for it to sort of negate some of the benefits of exercise. Can you comment on that?
I can't.
Okay.
That's outside my area of expertise.
You've talked a little bit about ratios of like THC to CBD, and I know you said everybody's different how we figure that out, but can you speak to like the generality of, okay, let's start here, let's have this ratio to do this?
So that's a good question. And so ratios come in, and I'm going to talk about the ratio of THC to CBD. And so ratios can come anywhere from 1 to 1, where you have equal parts of THC and CBD, and you can get 2 to 1, you can get 3 to 1, 4 to 1, you can get 20 to 1. And so for people that are very, very sensitive to THC, I would recommend finding the absolute lowest amount of THC. But I believe that it's important to have some THC. even if it's a small amount, it sort of kicks that CBD into gear because of this entourage effect. And so the recommendation would be, especially if you're a new user, to find a ratio with a lot of CBD and a small amount of THC, see how that works for you. And then if you're not getting the relief you want, maybe you go to something with a little bit more THC. Now I've tried all the different ratios. Even though I'm an experienced cannabis user, I've been using it for a long time, even a 1-to-1 ratio of THC and CBD will still give me make me feel high, and I don't want to be high during the day. Whereas a 2-to-1 ratio, I don't feel that, and that seems to be my sweet spot for giving me the relief I want, but allowing me to be functional. But somebody else, a 2-to-1 is still going to be too much. So, really look at that, but start with the lowest amount of THC possible, and then work your way from there. Cisco.
Sure. What company do you recommend?
I don't. I'm not here to recommend companies. Do your homework. Sorry, I'm not here to endorse a company or say what's great or not great. And one thing that's going to work for you, it's no different than nutrition. Power bar is great for somebody and somebody else wants scratch. So really what works for me probably is irrelevant anyway for you.
Do you have experience with local companies versus?
Well, in terms of things with THC products, you're only going to be able to get things from Colorado because of the federal illegality of it if you cannot take it across state lines. So CBD, now you can buy that mail order, but if you're buying anything with THC in it, it's made here in Colorado. Mark, you had a question?
Yes, so obviously you heard about the triathlete that got
Positive for doping.
Yeah, positive for doping. So, I'm not asking you to speculate, but do you think, you had one slide up there that showed that, 31% of the, that one. And so do you think that what she was explaining, that she took the screen based on the fact that it said, whatever, I can't remember percentages, but it had this amount of THC that was legal according to whoever does the testing, but then obviously the testing showed that it was way above that. Now, do you think that it was subject to something like this?
Well, I can't necessarily speak to that case by itself, but I will say as a generality, that if you're going to be drug tested, that there's probably no amount of THC that's safe, because it does get stored in your system. And I don't know this to be true, although there are some studies that do indicate that exercise can actually release THC into the system as well. So if it's something that you're going to be drug tested for, I would recommend stopping use well before the time you're going to be tested. Now, they don't test for it out of competition, so they don't look at that. But if you know that you have a race coming up and there's a probability you're going to be tested, you need to stop your use way beforehand, because even though the threshold is what they consider relatively high, and it's much higher than it would be in workplace testing. I think it's 10 times higher than workplace testing. You can still test positive. We are still seeing positives for THC, not just with what happened with the triathlete, but in other sports. So, it's very tempting, and it's good to think it's safe, and it's not, we know a lot of people that are using it, and the number of people that are, testing positive is relatively small, but it is a risk. And so, to be safe, if you're going to use the CBD product, you must get it from a place that you know that they have tested it, that you can rely on it, that it's not going to be one of these companies that doesn't have good testing, or just don't use it at all.
So to address the other half of that, if the company you're looking at doesn't have their testing protocol online for you to look at, maybe it's best to pass over that?
Either that, or like I said, Consumer Labs does independent testing, and they always give the recommendations of which products to purchase based on their results. And so that's another place to look, because they test it themselves. And so they'll tell you which products failed their test and which ones passed their test. Consumer Labs. You had a question?
Yeah. So over time, can you build products? Can you build dependence? And talk about after they're concerned about being tested and coming off of it, can they wean off of it? Or can you just stop it or not sending adverse?
I think that's going to be different for everybody. Yes, you can build a tolerance to it, but everybody's different. I've been using cannabis for 5 years. I've not built a tolerance. The amount of THC I took to sleep 5 years ago is the amount I take now. But other people I know build a tolerance, and they might need double what they were taking. So again, this is something that's just like any other medication. It's very variable. Yes, there is something called cannabis use disorder that people talk about in terms of just quitting cold turkey. I think that's going to be variable from person to person. One thing they do recommend for people that are using it on a regular basis is to kind of have a washout period where you don't use it for a few days because your system resets very quickly. So if you do find that you're building a tolerance, just lay off of it for a few days, and then you can kind of start back to a lower dose. Yes.
So I had a question. So with you were talking about the receptors. Did we know about those before
Yes.
cannabis?
Yes.
We did.
Oh, before cannabis, no. So THC was actually discovered in 1964, and the receptors were discovered after that because the question was, well, what does it bind to? Why does it work in our bodies? And so those were found later.
There have been studies on, like, let's say you're trying to reduce inflammation locally in a small area. Have there been any studies that show taking it sublingually versus topically is beneficial one way or the other?
Not really.
Okay.
I mean, it needs to be done. Right now there's really still aren't a lot of studies just on the pharmacokinetics, meaning, when you take it, if you put a topical on, what happens over time, how is it absorbed? I mean, those studies are still being done. So it's still hard to know. So that's why, that's why there's going to have to be a lot of self-exploration on it. Because for some people, topicals are amazing. They love it. I mean, I hear stories of topicals, and for me, like, I use topicals, and for my neuropathic pain, they don't do anything. But when I get muscle pain from the neuropathic pain, it seems to help for that. So it really is going to depend what you're using it for, and it's going to be very variable from person to person. And you can get topicals that are CBD only. You can get topicals with THC. So it can be very complicated trying to figure out what works for you. Yes? Yep.
I just have a question to the experiment setup still. Someone said we have different people who have people were answering questions, and was someone there to evaluate the results, or
I'm sorry?
was there somebody to evaluate the results, or was it just like
I evaluated the results.
No, but you have the paper, right? You didn't
Yes.
see the person in person and talk about the results.
I'm sorry, what are you asking?
It was anonymous.
It was an anonymous survey.
And the control group, how did you make sure it wasn't just a, whatever you call it, like an accidental perfect result you needed?
Oh, there are no such thing as perfect results. I mean, look, anytime you do a questionnaire survey, there's always the difficulty with bias, whether people are telling the truth or whether they're not answering the questions, and but we had a lot of internal consistency in our answers. Like they made sense. Like we didn't see things that were super crazy. And so, and we had a lot of people that weren't using it. We also have a lot of results here that I didn't present that lend to the credibility of the answers to the questions. Yes.
Where can we buy CBD from a pharmacy?
Right now, tonight. You can walk out with some CBD tonight. All the way in the back.
Hey, you might have answered this, I'm sorry, I was back there with the kid. This is purely from the elite athlete perspective, and I know Mark touched on Lauren Cross today. I have a lot of emails, private messages coming in that, in their opinion, THC isn't performance enhancing. But there's a lot of anecdotal evidence that proves that it isn't anxiety, stress, and raising that awareness. And I looked at a lot of the details that WADA had, and they said that it is obviously performance enhancing, but it also it's not within the spirit of competition. I just want your opinion, having spent a lot of time doing the research, whether you think over time this will end up being a pass where they will allow it to come in, or whether you see this as potentially being just a clear-cut ban across the board for the top athletes?
Well, you know, it's interesting because one of the questions I asked was improved performance, and only about, I think 13% said that they felt improved performance. Now, yes, we can say that maybe secondarily it improves performance because if you have less pain and you have less anxiety and you can sleep more, that your performance is going to be better. But there are already a lot of legal drugs on the market, like ibuprofen is going to reduce your pain, and people are taking Ambien, which is going to help you sleep. And a lot of people are on prescription medications to help with anxiety and depression. So in my opinion, this is safer than a lot of those medications. And so if we're going to allow caffeine and alcohol and all of these other, you know, opioids and, you know, benzodiazepines and antidepressants, if we're going to allow those things, then I think we should allow this.
So that'll look, so what it's saying is eventually this will be allowing alcohol was banned back in
Right.
1936 or whatever it was. So I'm assuming if the studies work out, you see this has been the same as ibuprofen and everything else now.
I think so. And the NFL and the NHL are talking about legalizing it, and it seems to me if those sports legalize it, it's going to really change the perception of medical cannabis. And you know, I just think that if there's something here that's helping a lot of people with less harmful effects than other things that they could be taking, then we should let them take it.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't think that professional athletes should be penalized because they're a professional athlete.
So, that receptor, right?
Yes.
What does our bodies have that for, and what does it do?
Oh, now you're getting into hard science. So basically, we make things that bind to those receptors, anandamide and 2-AG, and it binds to those receptors, and it's throughout the whole body. And so if you have improper binding or if there's dysregulation, then you can end up with disease states. So things like IBD when this whole process becomes off, people can end up with things like IBD or other types of inflammation. This is not my area of expertise to really go into it. I mean, I went to a conference where they were talking about stuff. I actually had to pull my phone out and Google words because I had no idea what they were talking about. But I know enough that when things are off, and there are a lot of other things that are involved in this whole like process, that when there's something is thrown off, you end up with disease state. And
But you don't know, so you know that when it's off that you have a disease state, but you don't know what that receptor is for normal function.
Well, for normal function, it functions in the gut, it functions in the brain. It
do
functions,
what?
I don't know enough to answer that.
Okay.
I don't know. I would be giving you information that might be wrong. So I'm just going to leave it there.
What's your opinion on that source of like finding out, like going from here, like finding good doctors like in the area or websites or anything like that? Like, what's the next resource? What's your recommendation?
Leafly has some pretty good resources on there. They have some good articles. You know, there's not really great information out there. You know, like when I look for stuff, I go to Google Scholar and I try to look for the actual research that's out there. I mean, there are articles coming out all the time. I mean, I just would search things in Google, and you know, you'll have things come up. You just want to look and see where the source is coming from, and whether they're actually citing an actual research paper or they're just, you know, citing some BS from somebody that doesn't know anything.
What about doctors? Like finding, you know, like cannabis doctors out there who do prescription and stuff like that. So like, you know, what's the best way to find someone? You know, you said, you know, talk to cannabis doctors.
Yeah, I mean, there are some around. I mean, I'm not gonna stand here, you know, if people have questions, they can come to me, but there are a lot of terrible cannabis doctors. I get a medical card.
What is a cannabis doctor?
So if you want to get a medical card, you have to go see a cannabis, a doctor that deals with cannabis that will look at your qualifying condition and say whether or not you can get your card. And I have been to doctors that will sit down and give me a lot of information, and you should try this, and this would be really great. And I've been to doctors that are just like, oh, you had your card last year, let me just sign this for you. So there is a difference, and I know some of the good ones around, so if people have questions, they can come ask me. And the other thing too is that dispensaries also have lists of doctors as well, and they'll be able to tell you who the good ones are.
The dispensaries have been a decent resource with regards to talking to individuals about the THC CBD ratios?
That's a loaded question. Yes and no. Some of the the people that work at the dispensary called bud tenders, And some of the bud tenders give excellent information and some give egregious information. One of the big issues right now is that bud tenders are telling women who are pregnant that they can use cannabis during pregnancy for their nausea, and it is not safe to use during pregnancy. So one of the biggest issues we have right now is that education is very poor for bud tenders, for patients, for medical professionals. So not even just cannabis doctors, but if you go to a pain specialist and you say, I use cannabis, a lot of times they're like, I don't know what that means. So education is very poor right now.
So is there a resource like Yelp for dispensaries to check out this one? Don't go to this.
But it's not even necessarily the dispensary itself, it's going to be the bud tenders. There are some dispensaries that are better than others, but again, it's going online, reading, different resources, looking at Leafly, reading articles, so that you're going in with some knowledge, so that when they tell you something, you'll at least have some idea of whether they're telling you something good or bad.
Do you have a feel for the current pipeline on upcoming research on the effects of THC, sort of nationally? I know that there will be national resistance because of the illegality federally. So is NIH getting behind this, or is it mostly a university level, or et cetera? Do you have a feel for the pipeline of upcoming research?
It's a little bit of everything. So clinical trials are still a little bit difficult right now, and one of the really big issues with clinical trials is that if you get funding through the NIH or government funding, that the cannabis that you use comes from the University of Mississippi, and that is subpar cannabis. They've actually done genetic testing on it, and it actually is more like hemp than it is marijuana. So that calls into question all of the results from those studies, because what are they actually using? It's not the things that people are going to purchase at a dispensary. And they were supposed to, the DEA was supposed to give licenses to other growers. And like 3 years ago, that process was supposed to be started, and it didn't happen. There have been lawsuits, and so now that's being opened up. The NIH still seems to have a very slant toward looking at more adverse effects than positive effects. But studies are, we are still now seeing clinical trials, especially in other countries. Israel is doing a lot of work on cannabis. And because of these tracking apps that we have now, the ones I talked about that you can put on your phone, and there are a lot of companies now that own a multitude of dispensaries, and they're keeping databases. And so now there's observational studies coming out of what people, so it's not a controlled study. So these are medical cannabis users and tracking their symptoms. And there seems to be a lot of benefit for a lot of different conditions. And there is some hope that cannabis might be a substitute for opioids. And so people who are taking medical cannabis seem to use less opioids, and states that have legal cannabis have fewer opioid overdose deaths. So there is a lot of insight out there into some positive things that are happening. But in the same respect, I don't want to be one-sided. A paper came out this year in that the emergency department at the University of Colorado is seeing, and also in Pueblo, they're seeing a lot of cases of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, which is vomiting, extreme abdominal pain, and also people coming in for psychosis. So with all of the benefit that there is potential harm. So it has to be used responsibly.
And like you said, everybody's going to have a different
Everyone's
reaction.
going to have a different reaction.
So that person who might be vomiting, and if they have the proper dosage, might have a completely different effect.
Or it could just be their genetics that made them susceptible to it, and there might not be any dose that would be right for them.
Any other questions for Joanna?
Thank you, Joanna.
All right,
All
thank you
right,
very much.